The Maternal Thread by C.J. Van Pletsen, Into the Congo. The rains had ended, but the world still dripped. In 1971, Uri'el and Samuel crossed into the Congo, following a trail older than empires. They had left the Cape behind with barrels, journals, and a silence that spoke louder than any marching song. The map Zuriel had drawn had led them steadily north, through towns where no one asked their names, across borders that swallowed bribes like bread, and into jungles that breathed like a living beast. Uriel was 18, Samuel 2 years older. Both had the wiry strength of boys turned men by labor, and the scars of sons who had carried too much history in their marrow. The weight of the map. At night, Uriel unrolled the vellum map under a canvas lean-to, its copper stitching gleaming faintly against firelight. The 8-pointed star still seemed alive, its points whispering as though each demanded attention. He remembered Zuriel's hand across it, the steady scrawl of prophecy wrapped into geometry, and felt again the ache of blood speaking louder than reason. Samuel leaned over his shoulder, gnawing dried cassava. "It's pointing us to Leopoldville first, right? Or what's left of it now?" Uriel nodded. The route. The place Zuriel marked beneath the canopy. Jungle and ruins. That sounds like us. Samuel smirked. "You sure you weren't meant to drag a cartographer along instead of me?" "You are the cartographer," Uriel said without looking up. "Just not with ink." Samuel grinned at that, though he didn't fully understand what Uriel meant. Roads of ash, the truck that had carried them north broke down before Kisangani, its coughing engine finally surrendering to the weight of rust, heat, and endless dust. For a long while it sat there on the rutted track, steam rising from its hood like incense from a broken censer, until the silence of the jungle reasserted itself. And even the driver's curses faded into the trees. Beyond lay only paths where wheels could not follow, arteries of earth beaten narrow by feet, hooves, and the patient passing of caravans older than the memory of empires. From there they traveled on foot. Their guide appeared as if summoned, though no one had called for him. He was wiry, his ribs drawn tight against the skin, as if hunger had carved him lean and the forest itself had tempered him hard. He introduced himself only as Kabila, a name without elaboration, without lineage, as though he had shed every tether to family or tribe. His French was sparse, dry as stone, his patience less. Yet he moved with a confidence that made both Uriel and Samuel feel like children clutching at the hem of some ancient teacher. The machete he carried was no tool but a limb, an extension of his sinew and will. In his grip, it did not merely cut vines, it commanded space. Uriel noticed the reverence that passed between villagers and the hunter. Men lowered their gazes, women shifted baskets to offer the path. Children stared at him as if he were a story stepped out of the fire. Samuel noticed something else. The scars. Thin, pale seams laddered across Kabila's arms, jagged tracks across his shoulders, and one deep bite mark cleaving the flesh of his thigh. Scars of beasts, yes, fang and claw. But others were unmistakably human. Machete duels, bullet grazes, the testimony of too many battles with men as wild as the jungle that had mothered them all. They paid him not in coin, but in barter older than states, salt, coffee, cloth. These were currencies that outlasted banks, that passed through hands like scripture passed through generations. In return, Kabila gave them passage into the labyrinth of green, where light and shadow intermarried until the eye forgot which was master. By day, the forest was a cathedral without stone. Vines as thick as ship ropes swung down from unseen vaults, their weight bending branches like supplicants in prayer. Birds shrieked unseen in the canopy, their calls ricocheting like the cries of prophets warning in tongues too strange to decipher. Frogs croaked from the hidden watercourses, their voices like broken drums echoing war long forgotten. The air itself pressed upon them, heavy and wet, metallic with the odor of copper and the musk of decay. Every breath tasted like blood diluted in rain. By night, the cathedral inverted. The trees became pillars of darkness, their crowns invisible, their roots whispering in the soil. Fire sputtered low, its flame fighting to remain against the damp, as though reluctant to be born. Smoke crawled over their faces and disappeared into the canopy. The jungle whispered to itself, then creatures hunting, branches shifting, the subtle susurration of countless unseen lives arranging themselves just beyond the ring of light. Uriel's dreams grew sharper in that place. Sleep no longer gave him rest, but visions, and in them Zuriel's voice returned, solemn and immovable, as if spoken from some mountain older than the world. Watch the rivers, watch the bloodlines, trust the shield. Each phrase repeated like scripture carved into his marrow. The rivers, he thought, were more than water. They were arteries of history, carrying trade and blood, faith and betrayal. The bloodlines, yes, his own tangled inheritance. The covenant etched into his flesh by fathers and strangers alike. And the shield? A mystery yet. Perhaps faith itself. Perhaps Samuel. Perhaps the blade carried secretly in his pack. He did not know. He only knew the words rang with inevitability, as though one day he would stand upon their meaning like a man upon a scaffold. He woke each time with sweat cooling fast in the damp air, and always Samuel was awake before him, crouched over the small fire, coaxing it back to life. His face glowed with a quiet humor, a grin faint yet faithful, as if he carried within him a secret flame that no jungle damp could extinguish. Samuel did not speak of the dreams. He seemed to know them without words, the way brothers sometimes share thoughts by silence alone. Uriel often lay still and studied him. Samuel's hands were steady, his movements simple, deliberate. He was no mystic, no visionary, yet there was strength in him as constant as the morning. Uriel wondered, as he watched, whether Zuriel's command trust the shield might not mean to trust Samuel's presence more than any weapon. Samuel was not a shield of iron, but of flesh and loyalty, an embodied promise against despair. And as dawn lifted each day through the tangle of branches, the forest breathing mist like incense around them, Uriel felt both the burden and the grace of that unspoken covenant, that they would walk the roads of ash together, wherever those roads led, into empires ruined or rivers still burning with prophecy. Echoes of Zuriel. The night had the hush of a sanctuary after the congregation has gone, only the breath of old wood, and the drifting ash of prayers lingering in the rafters. The fire was mostly coals by then, fat, red embers cupped in a cradle of damp black, their light pulsing like a heart that thought better of stopping. Insects pressed their tiny hymns into the dark, and somewhere just beyond the reach of the camp, a river murmured to itself, syllables broken on rock. A moth cartwheeled through the smoke like a scrap of burned scripture and vanished. Samuel spoke quietly, as though he had matched his voice to the slow beat of the coals. Do you ever feel like your grandfather's still walking behind us? Uriel did not answer at once. He tipped his chin toward the embers and let the heat work its way into his face and throat. The question opened a door in him that he kept latched, because through it came the old house with its cedar lintel and the smell of cardamom tea. and the manuscripts wrapped in cloth under the floorboards, and the steps of a man whose footsteps continued after he himself had stopped moving. Uriel let the door swing on its hinges, just enough for the memory to look in. "Not behind," he said finally, the words drawn out of the fire like metal out of ore. "Through." He watched the faint curl of steam rise from a wet log, as though it, too, were something a grandfather might whisper. He knew Evea would hide Leora away, Uriel went on. He prepared for it. The 3 barrels he left with Tiro, they weren't only for wine. Samuel tilted his head, one eyebrow up, more cautious than skeptical. He always wore his incredulity like a loose garment, easy to shrug off, easy to put back on. "Then what?" "They were for us," Uriel said. The words surprised him by how naturally they settled on his tongue, as if they'd been waiting there for months, maybe years, biding their time. "One for the architect's blood, one for the maternal thread, and one for the shield." The word shield rose and hung between them, catching a thread of moonlight and a long-buried grief. Uriel lifted his gaze until it rested on Samuel, not to pin him, but to steady him, the way one steadies a candle with a hand around the flame. "He knew you'd be needed," he said. "Knew you'd carry Tiro's echo." Samuel's throat moved with the swallow he couldn't disguise. For once, humor slunk away from him like an animal from a clearing. "You mean he expected me?" Uriel nodded. The nod was not emphatic. It had the heaviness of fact. "He didn't leave anything to chance," he said, and while he spoke, he felt the presence of Zuriel's voice descend like a weightless mantle. "Watch the rivers. Watch the bloodlines. Trust the shield." Even when chance tried to interfere. The fire cracked on a knot. A sheet of orange briefly flared and then collapsed into ember. In that brief brightness, Uriel saw again his grandfather's hands, their skins stained with pomegranate and ink, saw the way the old man had sealed each barrel in the dim storeroom under a low lamp, pressing a signet into warm wax that bore a design no common merchant would recognize. The stylized river, the braided thread, the round boss of a shield, all crossed by a line like an oar or a sword. The old man had whispered to each, as if they were sleeping children. Samuel tried to laugh then, but the sound arrived without its usual footwork, without the little dance his laughter used to do. It came bare and earnest. "Then I'd better be worth it," he muttered, and the words, though kept small, trembled like a wire in wind. "You are," Uriel said, and for once there was no edge in his voice. The blade of his skepticism lay sheathed, and what remained was the simple weight of faith. He did not often lend his faith. When he did, it rested on a person like a hand upon a shoulder, firm, warm, irrefutable. Silence followed, but it was not empty. The jungle filled it with its own catalog of pronouncements, the distant bark of something declaring a border, the leaf whisper of lizards, the arithmetic ticking of frogs. Uriel felt the sentence he hadn't spoken continue walking through him. "You are because you always were." He thought of bloodlines braided not by law, but by need, of how the old stories understood adoption not as paper, but as covenant. He had always taken pride in carrying what he called the hard truth, that fate bent like reed to the hand of those who dared, but age had introduced him to another truth, that certain currents ran deeper than volition. Rivers chose their beds long before a man ever set a map to the table. And yet, watch the rivers, Zuriel had said. Watch them, not to command them, but to see how they braid and unbraid, how they carry silt and rumor, salt and prophecy. Uriel's thoughts drifted to the barrels again. Oak, darkened by oils, iron bands the color of storm water, the sweet copper smell when the bung was first loosened. He imagined the architect's blood not as a literal crimson, but as lineage sealed in files names that could be spoken when other names had been burned, a design recoverable after the blueprint had been taken by flood. He imagined the maternal thread, artifacts stitched with hair, a shawl woven with an encoded cadence of knots, a hymn pattern concealed in the warp, and weft for those with ears to see. And the shield, yes. The third barrel perhaps not a shield at all, not wood or iron, but a man's heart pledged, or a phrase designed to be spoken at a threshold. Not this house, not this child. Through all of it ran his grandfather, not behind, but through like the invisible fiber that strengthens a rope, like a quiet river running underneath a noisier one. A man whose footprints continued in their feet. The coals shifted. Sparks swarmed upward and flickered out like a constellation that had chosen, at last, to descend and cool among men. Samuel tugged his blanket tighter around his shoulders. Uriel could feel the gravity returning to him, the gravity he mostly wore like armor. Yet underneath it, for a moment, a softness, a gratitude that he did not have to be a single blade cutting through vine and rumor alone. Trust the shield. He felt that he could. He felt that he did. Time moved in increments of ember, somewhere in the seamless night between wakefulness and sleep. Uriel heard his grandfather's tread cross the old cedar threshold one more time and vanish into the sound of the river.